In this video, we're going to talk about another feature of Berlin Woodwinds called the Articulation Performer. We're also going to explore some ideas that you may be able to use the Articulation Performer in setting up some templates for your projects. The recording app that you see before you here is Reaper, and it's my recording application of choice. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to right click over here and I'm going to insert a new virtual instrument. And I'm going to come down here to 64-bit plugins and I'm going to grab Contact 8 out and click OK. Now it's going to ask me, do you want to add the following tracks for this effect? And I don't want to do this. So I'm going to click no. So if we go down to Berlin Woodwinds and we click over to multis, we can see that we have a few things here. I'm going to jump in the 1.6 folder. And here we have a collection of contact multis for each instrument. So for example, let's grab something like the first clarinet. I pull that over there, it's going to say replace multi, pressing no will merge. And since I don't have anything, I'm just going to say yes, go ahead and do that. If you had stuff in here, dragging over a multi will replace anything that you had over here. This is the Articulations Performer. This is a way that you can control multiple articulations from within one patch or one instance, one track. So on the flip side, you could just have multiple tracks for each one of these articulations. You could pull them in as you need them, but this is a way to kind of have one MIDI channel control just about everything, and it works pretty well. So we're just going to look at how to set this up and talk about a couple ideas that may work for you. Up here we have some cells, and we can load articulations in these cells. Now by default, when you load the Articulation Performer, you can see that the memory usage is 0. And as we add articulations to this, it will load them into memory. And when we get rid of them, it'll delete them from memory. So it kind of manages the memory for you there, which is nice. Let's throw something in here. Let's put a staccatissimo. So now we have loaded up in this first cell, staccatissimo. And you can see that there are some key switches associated with these. Now, if I click over to the second cell here and I pick staccato, now we have these two articulations loaded. So as we're recording, we can fire some key switches and switch between different articulations. But the Articulation Performer goes even further. So what I generally like to do is I like to load things in order of shortest to longest. So usually I like to have staccatissimo, staccato, portato short, portato long, and then I'll load a legato here. And then if the patch has it, I usually like to load the runs in this 6th cell here. And this is kind of my core articulation pack. I mean, there's obviously more, and then I'll just kind of load them up as I need to. But what I like to do in general is keep everything the same so that, say I set this up for first clarinet, when I'm recording, I want to have all of the same articulations for the other instruments. So because I use these articulations most frequently, these are the ones that I'll go ahead and load when I create the other instruments so that all of my key switches line up everywhere. So now I have control over all these. I have legato here. And I have everything else all where it needs to be. Now the only thing that I need to do is I need a way to be able to key switch these. Because the keyboard that I use is a smaller keyboard. It's a 61 key keyboard. And I use it primarily because it fits on my desk. Because of this, you can see the range that I have here between the lowest C and the highest C is right here. And that is not going to make these key switches work because they are going to fall down here in this lower octave. Now that is a problem for convenience sake because I don't want to be constantly transposing my keyboard every time I need to make a key switch. So I've come up with a little bit of a workaround. Now the keyboard that I'm using here is an old keyboard. It's a Ensoniq TS10, which is made in 1993, but it still works fine. It's a nice keyboard, and I've gotten used to it over the years. The only inputs that it has, other than the keys, though, are a mod wheel, which you can see here, and a pitch bend wheel. And so to augment and make this a little bit more usable for myself, what I've done is I have a Korg Nano Control 2 that sits right above the keyboard. And I use this to get more control over different instruments and programming. The Korg Nano Control kind of looks like a device that you would use as kind of transport and track controls, but I never use it like that. What I do use it for is controlling things like CC1, CC2, which is mod wheel and breath controller, CC11, which is expression, CC7, which is usually volume. I'm going to load up the Korg editor so you can see. Now, there's a bunch of different products that may work for you if you're in a similar situation that you don't have a full-size keyboard. But you can see that this is the Korg Nano Control 2. You can't really see, but we'll look at it more in detail in a second. But they also have things like the Korg Nano Key, which is basically a 2-octave keyboard. Then they have a Nano Pad, which is basically a bunch of pads and some other buttons and I think a little trackpad or something. But I want to show you how I've set up my Nano Control here. And the reason why I like this is I've taken these transport controls, which are normally, rewind, fast forward, stop, play, record, and then these other kind of track transport controls. And I've reprogrammed those to note inputs. So I can get 11 different key switches from right here. And if I needed more, I could requisition one of these buttons to do that. Now there's a little kind of weirdness. If I jump over here to multis, this time I'll grab the first bassoon. I'll throw that in here. Now, as we just looked at, I have this Korg Nano Control set to C0 to A sharp 0, essentially. And if I press these buttons, you can see that nothing is happening. But if we look over here, you can see that it's definitely getting input from here. And in fact, if we roll, we will see, if we look in the MIDI roll here, or the piano roll, that these are definitely being routed, but for some reason they're not triggering in contact. And this is a weird, strange thing. I don't know if it's something to do with Reaper or Contact or Korg. My gut tells me that this is a weird thing between Korg's idea of where middle C should be and where Native Instruments' idea of middle C should be. Because as I understand it, Kurzweil and Korg use C4 as middle C, Roland uses C5, and Native Instruments and Steinberg use C3. So all I have to do here is if I set the key switch start to C-1, now look, now it works. So for some reason, there's an octave shift between what this Korg is saying and what Reaper thinks is the right input, which is actually correct, and what Contact is seeing for this key switch. Anyway, it's a simple thing. And that's actually the reason why I set that to C0 is because I know that there's this weird thing in Contact between this hardware and this DAW. So that's how I've straightened that out. The other thing, by default, when you load up an Articulation Performer multi, what you'll see is that the default key switch start is C0. And that works for just about everything except for the lower instruments like the bassoon. So if we load up an articulation here, let's load up Staccatissimo, and let's jump back here to the piano roll. You see that the lowest note here is this A sharp. And so the reason that the default key switch won't work is if I set this back to C0, now that note will work, but this note won't work. So for whatever reason, in the script, I would imagine, this key switching basically requisitions the octave from C0 all the way up to B0. So this note and this note, B and B flat, you can't get because that's being kind of blocked by the key switching. That's basically why I have it set up like this. And as long as I set up all the templates like this, everything will work just fine. So if I go and put this back where it's back to C-1 there, now I can get access to these lower instruments. Now, the only one possibly that this would cause a problem with is the contrabassoon, because that's a full octave lower than the regular bassoon. And so you can see by default, they have the key switch start to -2, which makes sense. But because I don't use this instrument a whole lot, and if I did have to use it, I could probably get away with programming everything with a legato patch and then, manually drawing in the key switches there. It's not really a big deal for my workflow, but I could make everything C-2, and then it would work for everything. But for now, it works just fine the way I have it. Templates can always kind of flux and change as you're working and as you get new libraries and new plugins. So let's jump back here to the Clarinet Articulation Performer and just talk about a couple other cool things that you can do with this. So like I said before, I like to have a couple of standard things loaded in. And we'll set this to -1. So now I have control over the key switching, and that's all fine. But you see there's a couple of other things that I just want to briefly go over here. Let's say you were on a legato patch. And what you really needed was legato with a little bit more accent. We can load additional articulations down here in these lower cells, and there's basically 3 ways that we can use these. I could load, for instance, a portato short, and because we've already loaded one up, it's not going to reload it in memory. And now I have these articulations down here. And if I look here, it says vertical align CC21. So if I move CC21 here on my nano control, I can go back and forth between those 2 cells. And so that can be another way that you can get more from a smaller group of key switches, if you will. It does involve another MIDI channel here, but there are other ways that you can use this too. This button right here links these 2. So now we have legato plus portato short. And because legato is a mod wheel control and portato is the velocity, if I turn the mod wheel down, you can get a bunch of different combinations like this. You can also take any one of these cells and adjust the velocity range. So let's say that I only wanted the velocity for this portato short to be above 90. So if I play lightly, nothing will happen. But as soon as I bump up above velocity 90, then that articulation will come through. Which can be a way that you can use this with legato all the time. There's another way that you can use this as well. And I'll load up another cell here. I will put sustain here and then trills. And that's this morph button right here. So here we have sustain. So this is polyphonic. But with this morph enabled, we can actually crossfade between these. So now we're in the trill. Which is another really interesting use for this. You can see you can get a ton of options here, and we can add more cells and more cells. I think you can get up to 12 cells here, plus all the stuff down here too. So there's a lot of combinations that you can do. For example, another way that you could use this, if you wanted to load up more and have less key switching, is you could load staccatissimo and then staccato down here, link them, and say, I only want staccatissimo to come through when it's basically below, let's say, 70. And then I only want staccato to come through from 71 up. And what you could do, click the script button to make this go away here. We'll come down here to those short notes and we'll expand them. Now by default, the staccato and staccatissimo are set to velocity, but we could set these to crossfade, for example. And now, when we play quieter, we get the staccatissimo samples, and the dynamic is controlled with the mod wheel. But if we want a staccato articulation, all we have to do is play with a velocity above 70. So we'll play a little harder. There's a tremendous amount of combinations of these that you can do. I have my own certain way that I like to have it set up, but you will figure out what works best for you. There's a lot of possibilities and a lot of things that you can load in here. Another consideration too is when you have a lot of articulations loaded in here across a number of instruments, it can kind of start blowing up your memory just a little bit. In Reaper, we're looking at about a gig of memory between this instance of Kontakt, what's loaded here in the memory, and whatever else we have, which is actually not really that much. But if we get a handful of these loaded, the memory will start to get right up there. So another idea that you could do is you can purge all of these, and then as you play them, it will stream them from the disk and load them in memory. Now, depending on your system, this may not work super well for you because there may be some kind of lag. For me, everything plays almost instantaneous as I'm kind of creating and writing the lines, and then on the second playback, everything is loaded into memory. The only exception to those is with the round robins, because on the shorter samples that have round robin, you play them once, it'll load up one round robin, but if you play the note again, see, it will have to load up all of those until everything gets loaded in. So you could do a combination of kind of purging everything and then just loading the short samples and then saving that as your template. Whatever works for you. For me, I think I have almost all the instruments saved as a template so that when they load, everything's purged and then everything plays nearly instantaneously when I'm playing it on the keyboard. But again, that may not work for you. After you get this loaded the way you want, you can name your track here. So we can call this Clarinet 1. I'll just name it Multi because that way I'll know that it's not an individual articulation somewhere else. And then you can save that. In Reaper, really easy to do. All you do is select the track and go to Save Tracks as Template, and you can save it as something. And then when you go to pull it up, again, I have another one saved here. I'll show you. I can just go up here, and I'll load up the Berlin Woodwinds clarinets. And there you go. I get Clarinet 1 and 2. Now I've taken all of the woodwinds and kind of color-coded them to work with the rest of the instruments, which you'll see later on in the coming sections. This is what works for me. And then, so you can see here, if we look at the Clarinet 1 Multi, you can see that I have it loaded up and it's been purged here. And the key switches, just the way that I like them. So everything works just fine. And as I play them, everything plays nearly instantaneous for me, and that works fine for my workflow. But again, you may have a different workflow that works better for you. So that's basically the idea there. You can get all your instruments kind of set up like that. And the only other consideration is that running multiple instances of Kontakt does give you another memory hit there. I'm not exactly sure the memory, depending on how you have Kontakt set up and your DAW and on how much it's going to use, but it will be a chunk over a bunch of instruments. If you have a dozen instances of Kontakt or more open, that's going to be possibly over a gig of memory on top of the samples loaded. So it's just another thing to consider. This is just a way to do it. So I wanted to show you that there, and hopefully that's helpful for you as you're setting up templates and getting in there and starting to make some great sounding music.